To what the F is going on in Latin America, CODEPINK's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of Latin America and the Caribbean. We broadcast every Wednesday, 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. Tonight, we bring you a special edition of our program. We are joined by Ben Norton, journalist with The Gray Zone. He is speaking with us live from Quito, Ecuador this evening, where last Sunday, Ecuadorians went to the polls to elect a new president, as well as National Assembly legislators. The February 7 presidential election results have Rafael Correa's successor, Andres Aruñas, at 32%, roughly 32%, followed by indigenous candidate Yacu Perez at 20%, neoliberal candidate Guillermo Lasso at 19.5%, and Javier Hervas at just over 15%, slightly less than 16 actually. With no candidate achieving 40% of the vote with a 10% lead, a second round of elections has been scheduled for April 11th. Welcome, Ben. So happy to have you joining us from Quito.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak with CODEPINK.
So let's talk about, let's start our conversation with what you saw in Ecuador on Sunday the 7th. You were there as a journalist for The Gray Zone. Can you describe to us the political climate on the ground, what voter participation looked like, and what you saw, the dynamic at the polls?
Well, the first thing to understand is that in Ecuador, voting is mandatory, which is true for some other countries in Latin America, although the participation rate here is probably between 70 or 80%. And from what I heard from many Ecuadorians here, including people who support Correa and others, who are opposition supporters, pretty much everyone agreed that this election was a disaster. It was extremely poorly organized, both here inside the country and internationally. I say internationally because there are at least 1 million Ecuadorians living abroad, which is very significant because this is not a huge country. So that represents a significant political constituency, and many Ecuadorians living abroad are supporters of the former president Rafael Correa, the socialist leader who launched the Citizens' Revolution. It's called a grassroots progressive movement here that's the dominant force in Ecuadorian politics. And there was videos showing Ecuadorians in the Bronx, New York, waiting for hours in line in the freezing cold, in sub-zero degree weather, with snow going on. So that was internationally. Domestically, it was very similar. There were people waiting in lines for hours in some regions. Now, I have to say that a piece of self-criticism of me and other international observers, there were dozens of international observers here in Ecuador for this February 7th election. Almost everyone was in Quito. So, Quito is the capital. It's one of the two major cities along with Guayaquil, and it has one of the largest populations in the country. But, if you're observing an election and you're only in the capital city, you're not going to see the irregularities going on in other regions. And in terms of what I saw, I saw long lines everywhere, and I heard people say that they had to wait an hour and a half, 2 hours in line, in some cases in very cold weather, or in some cases very hot weather, because Ecuador has kind of extremes. During the day, it's really hot. During the night, it's really cold. But frankly, in Quito, it wasn't as bad compared to other regions. Manabí, which is a major stronghold for Correísmo, the socialist movement, they had lines going on for hours. There was videos showing people getting trampled. And we have to ask, why were things so poorly organized? And the only answer you can come to, it wasn't just limited to an isolated location where you could just say that it was the local organizers who did a bad job. No, this was nationally and internationally. It was a complete disaster. And again, Ecuadorians said it was probably the worst modern election they've been through. And the blame for that lies on the CNE, the Consejo Nacional Electoral, the National Electoral Council, which is ostensibly supposed to be a neutral organization. But the reality is that under this current extremely authoritarian right-wing government of Lenín Moreno, which is totally backed to the hilt by the United States, and we can talk about that, but Moreno has really politicized the National Electoral Council in a way that we had not seen in the past. And the CNE, in fact, tried to revoke electoral observer credentials of observers from Spain because they were affiliated with left-wing politics, which is apparently a crime now under this government. And they also, they openly attacked left-wing Correísta candidates. Again, this is supposed to be a neutral arbiter, but the reality is that they did an extremely bad job. Now, we don't know what their motive is. We don't know if it's sheer incompetence or if it's intentional voter suppression. But again, what I heard from across the board is that people were really frustrated with how poorly organized the election was.
Isn't that amazing? That, I mean, you could, I have to say that is so antithetical to what we observed in Venezuela in December of 2020 for their National Assembly elections, which were even amid COVID-19 and implementing very stringent protocols to deal with voting under a pandemic. Very smooth, and the lines moved very quickly and very organized and very smooth. And so that's just, and that is not a US-backed government. So the irony of that is striking. So let's talk about the results specifically. No candidate achieved 40% or greater, and my understanding is in Ecuador it has to be a 40% win with a 10% lead or differential over the second candidate, and that did not happen on Sunday the 7th.
So Ecuador has a two-ring presidential election. The first round, like you said, there's two ways to win. You can get or get more than 40, and then that more than 40 has to be 10% higher than the next candidate. So as an example, you get 41%, and the second place candidate has 30%, you win the election in the first round. Now, the left-wing candidate, Andrés Arauz, who represents the Correísta movement, is a 36-year-old left-wing economist, a socialist who has a lot of very interesting ideas. He also believes in a kind of a technological democracy. So he would be one of the first leaders in the world who would guarantee free internet for everyone as a universal right and enshrined in the Constitution. And he also wants to have more forms of direct democracy through the internet. He's a very interesting candidate. He's also a brilliant economist with a PhD, speaks 4 languages. So, I mean, he's a very accomplished candidate. He's the most popular candidate, and polls consistently before the election showed him around 42 or 43%. Now, that's one of the many red flags we've seen here. The CNE, as I said, has been completely politicized and has been criticized not only by supporters of Correa, but even other anti-Correa opposition figures, because it's just such a blatantly politicized, undemocratic institution, or it has become that under this authoritarian Moreno administration. I should mention that the current government of Lenin Moreno has an 8% approval rating and 91% disapproval. Almost no one supports this government. Even the right-wing opposition had to pretend to be opposed to him, even though he was supporting the right-wing opposition. So the reality is that people are really angry. And Arauz got 32 or 33%, according to the CNE, which is suspicious because, again, I stress that most of the polls showed him with 42 or 43%, and they pretty much all assumed they were going to win in the first round. So there's a lot of questions about irregularities and potential fraud and whether or not the votes were actually counted accurately and fairly. But that aside, you know, that's something that will be determined in the upcoming weeks. But as for now, it looks like they're going to a second round on April 11th. And the question right now is, today is the 10th of February. We still don't know who the second place candidate is, which is pretty incredible. I mean, it's been over 2 days. The CNE claimed that they were going to have the quick count of the vote published at 8 p.m. on the night of the election on Sunday the 7th. They didn't have it up. And it's been a complete disaster. It's been very slow. There's been technical problems with the website. So again, just more an example of how poorly organized this election was. And right now, it's neck and neck between 2 candidates. Now, what's interesting is that right now, the second place candidate is a candidate named Yacu Perez, formerly called Carlos Perez, but he recently changed his name. And Yacu Perez is being marketed as supposedly a progressive candidate, but he's anything but. And I'll talk about him. I mean, he's actually extremely right-wing. He has supported right-wing coups across Latin America, including a coup in Bolivia. And he's an indigenous leader.
I was just going to say he changed his name to reflect the indigenous heritage.
Well,
or
I'm not going to get into that debate. It's a controversy here in Ecuador, but some indigenous leaders say that they don't consider him to be part of their community. So I'm not going to get into that. The identity issue is a complex discussion, but all I'll say is that he's not very well respected among many indigenous leaders and in many indigenous communities. And not only because of that, but especially because of his politics. This is a guy who's extremely right-wing. Again, he supported the coup in Bolivia in November 2019 against Bolivia's first and only ever democratically elected indigenous leader, Evo Morales. And he claimed, Yacu Perez has constantly attacked Evo Morales. Yacu Perez claimed that Evo Morales this is almost an exact quote, he is biologically indigenous, but in terms of identity, he colonized and whitewashed himself. That's the insane hyperbolic rhetoric that he hates Evo Morales. He supported the U.S. coup attempt in Venezuela. He supported the U.S. coup attempt in Nicaragua. He supported the soft coup against the left-wing Workers' Party government in Brazil. He supported the lawfare campaign against the progressive government of Argentina. He's an extremely right-wing candidate who is running as an environmentalist who supports abortion. So he's running as a kind of neoliberal candidate. I mean, he's running basically as a Democrat, right? As a capital D Democrat in Ecuador. Like he supports privatization policies. He supports deregulation. He actually said that he would support Guillermo Lasso in the last election. So this is a guy who supports the other right-wing candidate. And I mean, I can go down the list. So there's a lot to say about Yacu, but I'll talk about the third
candidate that is financed by the United States?
Well, what's funny is,
or supported it at least.
The U.S. backs both of the other candidates in second and third place. And in fact, Yacu Perez claimed, now this is what he claimed, we don't know if this is true, but it's pretty incredible. Yacu Perez, again, this is the fake progressive candidate who's running as an environmentalist, although we should question that, his commitment to environmentalism as well, which seems like marketing. But anyway, I'll get to that in a bit. But Yacu Perez claimed after the election that the U.S. Embassy called him and told him he will be the candidate in the second round before the National Electoral College even decided who the official candidate is. That's incredible. That is an incredible admission.
Wow.
And talk about U.S. meddling.
He actually said that.
Yes.
Wow.
Now, we don't know if that's true. I mean, this guy is a very strange character. He could be lying, but I mean, that's an incredible thing to say, even if it's... Anyway, so the other candidate to look at right now, who's neck and neck with Yacu, is Guillermo Lasso. Now, who is Guillermo Lasso? He is the most explicitly right-wing candidate. He doesn't pretend to be progressive. Guillermo Lasso is one of the richest people in all of Ecuador. He's an oligarch. He's a banker. In fact, he's frequently called the banker's candidate. And he's most infamous because Guillermo Lasso was economic minister here in Ecuador in 1999 when there was a massive financial crash that destroyed the Ecuadorian economy, that bankrupted millions of Ecuadorians, destroyed their life savings, and basically bankrupted the country and destroyed the currency. The currency lost all of its value, which is why people who had their bank accounts in the domestic currency, they lost all of their life savings. And he, of course, made many millions of dollars through that crash. I mean, he was just gambling state assets, extremely corrupt figure. The reason he's one of the richest people in Ecuador is because he uses his political office to just loot the country. And everyone knows, I mean, it's public knowledge that he hides a lot of his wealth in offshore bank accounts, like many of the elites here in Ecuador. And he has run 3 times. This is his 3rd time. And of course, he hasn't won any of those times. So Lasso is not very popular. And it's pretty incredible, actually, that he didn't come in 2nd place and that Yacu, who was very little known before, likely came in 2nd. But the question right now is, again, today is the 10th of February. We still don't know exactly who the candidate will be. There's a fight going on. The OAS is meddling here in Ecuador as well. So people should really pay attention to what's going on, because there are a lot of signs of irregularities. But right now, there's a 0.1% difference between Yaku Perez, who's slightly leading, and Guillermo Lasso, with 99.6% of the votes tabulated. So it could go either way right now. And either way, unfortunately, people are predicting that there's going to be violence, because whichever candidate is officially declared the second place candidate who will go to the runoff in April, the other candidate is going to say there was fraud, and their supporters are going to go out and probably commit acts of violence. So people are really...
So the violence will be among the neoliberal candidates, the conservative and neoliberal candidates, as to who will be, who will...
The reality is that the only non-neoliberal candidate is Arauz. You mentioned Javier Hervas. So technically there were over a dozen candidates in the election, but most of them got around 1% of the vote. There's 4 candidates who got more than like 1 or 2%. That is, the first place is Andrés Arauz, the leftist, the socialist. The second place right now is Yaku Perez, the fake left-wing environmentalist who's backed by the US as well. And then, and he's backed more by like the Democratic Party apparatchiks. He's backed by the NGO complex, the NED. And then there's the third place candidate, who is the banker oligarch Guillermo Lasso, who is backed more by like explicitly by the oligarchs and by, you know, like the more Republican forces. And then the fourth place candidate is Javier Hervas. Now, Hervas is from a party that calls itself the part of the left. The Democratic Left is the name of his party, La Izquierda Democrática. But like a lot of these parties, it's not left-wing. And historically, before Correísmo, it had kind of been a progressive party. But a lot of these parties, you know, over time, they just become more neoliberal, and they become controlled by like a family or a clan and some oligarchs. So Hervas is not a left-wing candidate. And in fact, there's a lot of discussion of Hervas will likely, if Yaku is the candidate, Hervas is going to form a coalition with Yaku against Arauz. And it'll be like the centrist candidate slash kind of liberal. Because another thing to recognize about Latin American politics, which is true throughout many left-wing movements, is that when we talk about leftists in Latin America, we're not talking about the same as the United States. In the United States, if you're on the left, it's assumed that you are going to be socially and culturally more liberal, right? But the reality in Latin America is that these are very working class movements, and a lot of working class people culturally are a little more conservative. So abortion is not really up for discussion. Although Andrés Arauz has actually broached the issue, which is interesting. Rafael Correa never talked about abortion. Arauz might make it an issue, but you know what's interesting is that the neoliberal candidates are excluding Guillermo Lasso, who's Opus Dei right-wing Catholic, but Hervas and Yaku, who are like the more liberal, I mean, they're still neoliberal, but they're like the more liberal cultural candidates. They're talking about abortion. They're talking about environmentalism. They're talking about these kinds of things that would be popular among Democrats in the United States. And honestly, if you listen to their rhetoric, you have to ask, who's their real constituency? Is it Ecuadorians, or is it North America?
I was just going to ask you that. Yeah. It sounds very much like the complexion of the US presidential elections in November, or leading up to November of 2020. And that whole, liberal, liberal centrist versus, what we call the left in the United States. You mentioned.
I have to say that some people have actually compared Yaku Perez to Kamala Harris. I think that's a very interesting and pretty accurate comparison if you had to pick someone in the US who you could compare him to. And I should also mention that what's very interesting is that Yaku Perez, again, he claims to be a progressive, but in an interview, a journalist asked him, they said, Andrés Arauz, the leftist candidate, has proposed giving $1,000 checks to 1 million working class and poor families to kickstart the economy because of COVID. And I should mention that $1,000 in Ecuador is a lot of money. It's not like the US. I mean, here the minimum wage is $300 or $400 a month. So $1,000 check in the US would be like $5,000 or $10,000 a month. That's a lot of money.
It's about 3 months of income for someone.
Not at all.
Yep.
Yeah. And Yaku Perez said, I do not support that policy at all, because if you gave poor people $1,000, they would spend it all on beer overnight in one night.
Oof.
So this guy is not a progressive. He's being marketed as a progressive. In fact, he's being marketed as a progressive by right-wing groups in the United States, like the America Society Council in the Americas, ASCOA, which is funded by like every major North American bank, North American company, including many banks, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, ExxonMobil, Chiquita Bananas funds ASCOA. I mean, this is a
Formerly
deeply
known as
right-wing
United Fruit
institution.
Company.
Exactly. And they've been promoting Yaku Perez. So we should ask a lot of questions about this.
You know, you could really, listening to you, we're basically talking about election interference, electoral influence, at the very least, by the United States. And last week, prior to the elections, so I got early February, the current Ecuadorian president was in Washington, D.C. and actually visited with the OAS, with Luis Almagro. Let's talk about that for a moment, because you brought up that you mentioned the OAS is influencing, is in Ecuador with an attempt to perhaps influence the electoral outcome.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned this, because of course, major media outlets won't mention this. This is a hugely important detail. 2 weeks before the election, right at the end of January, the current extremely authoritarian president here, Lenin Moreno, visited the United States for a week, and he had meetings with top officials in the embassy there in Washington, including he met with the head of Western Hemispheric Affairs for the National Security Council, who is Joe Biden's top Latin American policy advisor. His name is Juan Sebastián González, or as I joke, he's the bad Juan González, not like the good Juan González, the leftist journalist.
Not the one we love.
So Juan Sebastián González is a right-wing Colombian American. He is an extremely nefarious figure, and he's overseeing a lot of Biden's Latin America policy. He had a very friendly meeting with Moreno. Moreno published photos of the meeting on his Twitter account. He also met with the president of the the Inter-American Developmental Bank, and he met with the director of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Of course, I should mention that Moreno has taken billions of dollars of loans from the IMF, and what has he done with that money? That's not clear. He's extremely corrupt, and he has not engaged in any infrastructure projects. No one knows where that money went. We're talking about over $6 billion of loans. It really seems like that was just corruption money, that he was bankrupting the country and then stealing all the money and giving it to his rich friends. It's well known that Moreno works with mafia groups here, and there have been assassinations targeting recently. A high-profile TV presenter was assassinated in a very professional hit job when he was in his car. They were driving. Someone came up to his side, shot him with a very sophisticated weapon right when he was driving and killed him. So it's very clear that Moreno is working with a lot of these organized crime elements. The INA papers got no coverage in the US media, but they were a huge scandal here. What are the INA papers? These are documents that were leaked. INA papers. INA are the initials of Moreno's children. And it shows that he has stolen millions of dollars from Ecuadorian state coffers and hidden that money in offshore bank accounts. So this is an extremely corrupt figure. In fact, I don't even think Moreno is that ideologically motivated. I think the main reason that he turned on the Correísta movement and became a traitor is because he was bought off. I mean, he's just been bought off and given many millions and millions and millions of dollars. And he's probably going to go live in the United States after the election, or Panama.
There's a joke that we're saying here in Mexico that he was in Washington, D.C. looking for a new job. And
yeah. No, I mean,
yeah,
that's not even a joke. I mean, frankly, he was probably negotiating his negotiating citizenship or something. And I should mention that someone else that he met with at in his meetings at the embassy in Washington is he met with the former interior minister here in Ecuador, who's an extremely corrupt figure. She has also stolen many millions of dollars, and then she fled to the United States. And she and her family, there's actually public records showing that when she left her job as interior minister under Moreno and has been living in the United States and is probably going to stay there with her many millions of dollars that she stole. She has also been linked to oligarch families and mafias here in Ecuador. So we're talking about, I mean, it's like the Honduran government of Juan Orlando Hernandez. We're talking about a crime regime. Like this is not a government, and that's why it has 8% approval and 91% disapproval. So anyway, who else did he meet with? Moreno also met with Luis Almagro. I'm glad you mentioned him, because this guy, when people in Latin America hear his name, they spit. I mean, Almagro is one of the main organizers of the coup in Bolivia in 2019. The Organization of American States, as you all at CODEPINK have documented very well and protested against, the OAS was behind the myth that there was fraud in the October election, a complete lie, which was disproven by the Center for Economic and Policy Research there in DC. And Almagro has been totally disgraced. And the fact that he's still leader of the OAS is pretty incredible. I mean, he's just lost support of almost all governments in Latin America, except the most fervently, fanatically right wing. And he has been meddling here as well in Ecuador. And the OAS had sent its observers here. They recently met with the candidates like Lasso. So, you know, there's so many levels of irregularities, of meddling by the United States. We haven't even talked about the role of the United States in terms of funding all of these NGOs here, which are anti-Correa. But I should finally mention that the final people that Moreno met with when he was in Washington were members of the Senate, including Bob Menendez, who is a Democrat but is extremely hawkish against Latin America, supported the coup attempt against Venezuela and Juan Guaido. And he also met with Ben Cardin, who's another very neoconservative figure. So talk about election interference. 2 weeks before the election, numerous members of the US Senate who have a demonstrable history of meddling in Latin America. I should mention that Bob Menendez was mentioned, he was named specifically as one of the figures who was involved in the Bolivia coup. There were leaked audio recordings naming him, Marco Rubio, and Ted Cruz as being people who green-lighted the Bolivia coup and were working in collaboration with the coup mongers in Bolivia. So there's so many levels of U.S. meddling here, and then that doesn't even. And then when you compound that by the incredible irregularities and the fact that there's still not a clear second-place candidate. I mean, if this happened in Venezuela or Nicaragua, I mean, we would never hear the end of it. It would be 24/7 coverage in the U.S. media. The U.S. government would be calling for a new election or regime change. But here, there's no coverage at all.
Well, no, they might, because they have a U.S.-backed president in power now and are hoping to maintain that with a new name and a new face. So it, you know, I'm so happy to have you sharing this with us, because one of the things that we see in the States, living in the States, I mean, you're in Nicaragua now and me here in Mexico, but people, we don't seem to grasp as US citizens that there is US interventionism short of boots on the ground and dropping bombs on people. There are these forms of interventionism that are economic, that are legislative, constitutional, and we have seen this, what we would call soft coups, throughout Latin America to reverse what is known as the pink tide. So let's talk about the potential return of the pink tide of the citizens' revolution to Ecuador. What do you see happening? And I know for our audience, this is speculation, but Ben is currently on the ground in Ecuador. So what do you see as the possibilities for the second round of elections on April 11?
If the election is free and fair, Arauz is going to win. As I said earlier, Correísmo is the major political force in Ecuador. There's nothing to challenge it. It's like Sandinismo in Nicaragua, Chavismo in Venezuela. There are some opposition figures, but they're not united. They're often fringe, they're divided. There's no countervailing force that has a significant grassroots movement behind it, other than Correísmo. And it's extremely popular, particularly among poor and working class people, because the reality is that their quality of life significantly improved. And in fact, even a lot of middle class people acknowledge that their life was much better under Correa. it's really just the upper class, really elite rich people who all have dual passports and spend half the year in the United States or Europe. Those are the ones who are like the real forces against Correísmo in terms of the political backing who has capital. So if the election's fair, of course Arauz is going to win. And like I said, every single poll before the first round showed him leading. Every single one. Even like the most right-wing firm acknowledged that he was in the lead. So the question is, the real question is not who's going to win. The question is the vote going to be fair? And that's a question we can't answer. I mean, we have to just be careful and just be vigilant and watch to see what happens. Like I said, the current government is extremely authoritarian. I should mention that the Lenin Moreno administration has imprisoned numerous democratically elected officials from the Citizens' Revolution movement launched by Rafael Correa, including his former vice president, Jorge Glass, who has been locked up for years on bogus charges. He went on a hunger strike for more than 50 days and nearly died. He was hospitalized, and they still haven't released him. And there are other candidates, other mayors and National Assembly representatives who have been forced into exile. Some there in Mexico, where you are.
Yeah, I was going to say some of them are here.
Some of them were forced to live in the embassy, like Julian Assange. And speaking of Julian Assange was betrayed by this Moreno administration. He was given asylum and given citizenship. He was an Ecuadorian citizen, and he was protected by the former government of Rafael Correa. Well, the Lenin Moreno administration, as part of its deals with the United States and this corruption that he clearly is engaged in, he agreed to not only end the asylum, but actually to withdraw the Ecuadorian citizenship that Julian Assange had, and to allow British authorities to violate Ecuadorian law and international law and enter Ecuadorian sovereign territory and arrest Julian Assange and take him to prison. So we're talking about a government that has totally abandoned any pretense of caring about the rule of law. And as I said, they've totally politicized state institutions like the National Electoral Council, which is going to be the ones responsible for overseeing the second round of the election. And then I haven't even talked about the role of the media. I mean, the media here is just uniform, monolithic, constant propaganda. And I'm talking about both public media and private media. Everything against Correísmo. Everything against Correa and Arauz. But as Guillaume Long often says, Guillaume Long is the former foreign minister here under Correa and a very smart analyst. He's involved in the Grupo de Puebla, which is a new group of left-wing politicians and governments here in Latin America, founded right next to where you are in Puebla, Mexico. And Guillaume Long has said that if the election is free and fair, we're going to come back to power. So the question is, again, is the election going to be free and fair?
So there's a couple things. There's one thing I want to ask you just about the elections on Sunday the 7th. And then I'd like to just kind of finish up, because you've mentioned this term a couple times while we've been talking, is the role of movements, labor and social movements in the country. But before we go there, also on Sunday the 7th, in addition to the presidential elections, were the National Assembly elections. And so what does the composition of the new National Assembly look like? And how will the composition of the new assembly affect the next president's ability to govern the country?
Yeah, well, this is a really good question. Here I have, again, today is February 10th. There are 99.6% of the votes processed. So right now we see that the Unión por la Esperanza, UNES, which is the movement of Arauz, the Correístas, have 31% according to this, which again is pretty low considering the polls showed them in the 40 percentile range. So it's not very clear, again, if these are fair and accurate results. But according to the CNE, so the plurality of the seats will be from the Correístas, but not the majority, which is going to restrict what they can do. And then there's Pachakutik, which is the party of Yacu Perez, which is apparently in second place with around 18%. Pachakutik is a little complicated but it's not, they call themselves left-wing, but like Yaco Perez, they're questionable. They're actually pretty similar for people who follow Nicaraguan politics. There's a group called the MRS, the Movement for the Renovation of Sandinismo, which claims to be left-wing opposition, but often works with the right wing against the Sandinistas. And it's very close to NGOs. And Pachakutik is very similar. It's very closely linked to US government and EU member state funded NGOs. Pachakutik, in fact, its leaders were trained by the United States, by the National Democratic Institute, the NDI, which is an arm of the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, which is basically a CIA cutout founded by the Ronald Reagan administration to overthrow foreign governments. So Pachakutik is not a reliable party. Sometimes they might support progressive policies, but they're viciously against Correísmo, against Rafael Correa, and in fact have allied with the right wing against Correa when he was in power. In September 2010, there was a violent coup attempt that almost overthrew Correa. Hundreds of people were wounded, a dozen people were killed. And Pachakutik allied with the right-wing oligarchs and with the traitorous soldiers and police who refused to obey orders and turned against Correa and kidnapped him. So that's another example of how, if they can get back into power, the Correistas will have difficulty governing. The next candidate after them is the Partido de Izquierda Democrática of Hervas, which again calls itself Democratic Left, but is really a centrist party. They're like the Democratic Party in the United States, and they're against Correa as well. And they would probably form an alliance with Pachakutik of Yaco Perez, which together would give them about 30%, which would be almost the same as the Correistas. Then there's the Partido Social Cristiano, the Social Christian Party, which is a right-wing party that is very dominant in Guayaquil here, very right-wing, very conservative economically and socially. They're going to be a major obstacle against Correísmo. They have 9%. And then there's the Movimiento Creo, which nearly 10%, which is the party of Lasso, the banker, which has another 10%, a very right-wing party. So, I mean, this is not looking good for the Correistas. What we're seeing is that the Correistas might have around 1/3 of the National Assembly, but then 2/3 would be controlled by the opposition. And 20% of that is extremely right-wing. And then another third of that are parties that are kind of liberal, but very anti-Correa. So, you know, the reality is that if Arauz can get back into power, if the election's fair and he wins the election in April, he will be able to govern, but there's still going to be a lot of impediments to the Correistas being able to govern like they were at the kind of peak of Correa's power.
Wow. So it's, well, this is going to be fascinating to watch how it all plays out. And so before I let you go, I'd like to go back to the subject of social and labor movements and their roles in national politics, because we have seen, and especially in Bolivia, how the importance of having a political party come out of a movement versus the movement creating the party creating the movement, excuse me. So what we saw, for example, in Bolivia was the MAS candidate lose, or, you know, the election manipulated in October of 2019. And yet the social and labor movement allowed the party to remain very strong on the ground until new elections. And of course, that movement helped the MAS win and come back into power. And I don't think that those of us in the United States really understand the importance of that grassroots social labor movement, the power of that in articulating politics, in articulating economic policy, and keeping those issues alive among the people, not having the party lead the issues, but having the people from the ground up.
This is a really key question. And, you know, the thing about Bolivia is that it's a very unique case. And there's a lot of parallels with Ecuador, but there's a lot of significant differences. The reality is that the movement towards socialism, the MAS party in Bolivia of Evo Morales, grew out of the social movements. And in fact, the full name of the MAS party in Bolivia is MAS IPSP, IPSP, which is Instrumento Político para la Soberanía del Pueblo, which is political instrument for the sovereignty of the people. So the MAS is referred to as the political instrument, but then the social movements represent the voice of the people. In Ecuador, it's different. Correa didn't come out of the labor movement like Morales did, who was a campesino organizer. Correa is an economist. He's a socialist. He was a professor, and he was very popular, of course, and he has a big grassroots movement around him, but it's a difference. Bolivia is a very unique case. But the reality is that here in Ecuador, even though social movements are not nearly as powerful in Bolivia, most of the social movements are in favor of Correísmo. There are really two major social movements in Ecuador. There is Correísmo, and then there is the indigenous movements led by CONAIE, which is a confederation of indigenous groups. It doesn't represent all indigenous groups, and CONAIE is a complicated organization because there are very right-wing members like Yacu Perez, who is Pachacutic, his party, is the political arm of CONAIE, the indigenous confederation. So there are very right-wing members who have supported the banker Guillermo Lasso. In fact, one of the co-founders of Pachacutic, who was one of the leaders of CONAIE in 2012, he was briefly the banker Guillermo Lasso's vice presidential candidate against Rafael Correa. So I mentioned that CONAIE and Pachacutic played a key role in the 2010 violent coup attempt against Correa. So a lot of people in CONAIE are very against Correísmo. There are some leaders who are more left-wing, like there's a leader, Leonidas Issa, who has actually very harshly criticized Yacu Perez, saying that Yacu Perez is working with the right wing and working with Lasso. So it's complicated, but the reality is that when Correa was in power, CONAIE was one of the main opposition forces against him. And unlike Lasso and the bankers, the elites, who they don't have any social movement base, they just have money. They don't have anyone in the streets. CONAIE could mobilize people in the streets against Correa. So ironically, here in Ecuador, one of the main opposition groups is not actually right-wing. It's kind of liberal, indigenous, environmental, but it has a lot of links to foreign NGOs, foreign government-funded NGOs here. And as I mentioned, Pachacutic, the political arm of the Confederation CONAIE, was trained by the United States government. So the situation here is very different. And the reality, again, is that if the Correistas can get back into power, it will be difficult for them to govern, but they have a huge social movement of their own. And I went out and saw, I mean, it was very impressive. Here in Quito, which is more of a base of Correísmo, there were huge rallies in support of Arauz and Correísmo. And I filed a report at the Gray Zone. You can find it at thegrayzone.com, gray with an A. And I filed a report from the closing campaign on the 4th, February 4th, and there was a massive rally here in the center of Quito. And I also was in Guayaquil, which is more associated with the right wing, and it's more of kind of an elite city. And in Guayaquil, there was a huge march in support of Arauz and Correísmo, and there were tens of thousands of people, largely working class people, a lot of young people, a lot of women. So the Correístas have a huge base in the country, often based more in the cities, right? And then the countryside is often more CONAIE. So that's the balance of power in the country. It's not like Bolivia, it's very different. And we'll see what happens. But when it comes to political representation at the ballot box, by far the biggest force in the country is Correísmo.
Well, that's really, for those of us wanting to lift up the voices of average people, it's really encouraging to know there's a real chance that we will see the return of the People's Revolution in Ecuador. So it's fingers crossed. Here in Mexico and in the United States, I know a lot of people are really hoping to see a return of a government for the people in Ecuador. So Ben, I gotta thank you. Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I know we've gone too long, so sorry.
No, I'm happy to keep you talking. I'll talk as long as you have time. No, no,
I
not
wanted
at
to
all.
mention one other key detail that is extremely important, and you mentioned the pink tide. Ecuador is so important not only because of the people of Ecuador who are suffering under the worst economic crisis in modern history since the 99 crash overseen by Lasso, not only because poverty has doubled under Moreno and reached 56% according to the United Nations. So there's all these problems domestically, but internationally is even more important. Ecuador played a key role under Correa in supporting the institutions that made the pink tide a coherent international force. Specifically, the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, which is an economic alliance created by Venezuela and Cuba, and then Bolivia joined, Nicaragua joined, Ecuador joined. There were also some Caribbean countries joined. It was an economic alliance to try to kick out the US middleman. And they said, why do we keep doing business with US corporations? Why don't we just work together and help develop Latin America together? So Ecuador withdrew from the ALBA as soon as Moreno entered office. That was one of the first things he did, of course. And the US has been really dedicated to trying to destroy the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance. And that goes back many years. But one of the main reasons behind the 2009 coup in Honduras is because the president, Manuel Zelaya, democratically elected, who was not a socialist, he was a progressive nationalist, he allied with Venezuela and with Chavez and joined the ALBA. And Honduras had a military coup backed by the US, and they immediately withdrew from the ALBA. So that's extremely important. Andrés Arauz wants to return to the ALBA alliance. And then the other key institutional actor here is UNASUR, Union of South American Nations, which was really kind of like a United Nations of Latin America. You could kind of compare it to the African Union. And the headquarters of UNASUR were here in Quito, in Ecuador. And Lenin Moreno, after he came in and betrayed Correísmo, he kicked out the headquarters and withdrew Ecuador from UNASUR. So if Ecuador can come back, not only is that going to be great news for the Ecuadorian people, the working class people, but for the project of regional integration, which was at the heart of the pink tide, because these governments recognize that it's not enough to have domestic, progressive, socialist-oriented economic policy if we're still reliant on the United States as an economic power, as a market, as a purchaser of our goods. We have to be able to integrate South America as its own unique sovereign economic bloc. And if Arauz can win the presidency and come back to power, the Correístas are going to be, that's going to be a huge boon that's going to help bring back those economic institutions. And the only real remaining country which we could see after would be Brazil. Ecuador can come back, the pink tide is back.
That would be, you know what, I'm listening to you and I hear this term in my head, a return to multilateralism, a multilateral approach to foreign policy and economic policy versus a unilateral US-based, US-led economy and foreign policy. And that's a whole nother subject that I should have you come back and talk about, is this whole clash that we're seeing in the hemisphere, and I would argue across the globe, about multilateralism versus unilateralism. It's a real clash that we're seeing. So
yeah, I mean, it's the reality is that the United States considers itself the emperor of the world, the policeman of the world, and not just of East Asia and the Middle East and the South China Sea, but especially Latin America. That goes back to the 1820s and the Monroe Doctrine. Mm-hmm. And these institutions, these multilateral institutions, allowed Latin America breathing room for the first time in hundreds of years, because there were centuries of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism, and then there was American imperialism since the early 1800s. So these institutions, these multilateral institutions, are the best way for Latin America to be able to protect itself.
So we've got a lot to potentially look forward to. And so are you going to be in Ecuador? Are you going to be there in April again for the second round of elections, or you headed back to Nicaragua at this point, or both?
I'm going back to Nicaragua, but I hope to be back in April. Of course, it depends on COVID and the flight situation, but I plan on being back here.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let's have another discussion from Ecuador in April. And I hope to see you during our Sanctions Kill delegation to Nicaragua in March. So
I'll be there.
Okay.
I look forward to it.
Great, terrific. Thank you so much, Ben. Always wonderful to have you as a guest. Really enjoy our conversation. And this was profoundly informative for me and for our listeners this evening. So thanks a lot. And let's stay in touch and we'll do this again.
It's my pleasure, Terry. Thanks for having me, and keep up the great work. You all at CODEPINK are one of the most important organizations focusing on these issues.
Well, we tried. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.